is timber the savior of our industry when it comes to sustainability in the volume that we need to build? We're hearing in every country that in every capital city, that there's a housing crisis, there's accommodation issues, and we need to build more infrastructure and so on. So is timber that savior for our industry from a sustainability perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you said sustainability perspective, because I think the first question is, who are we trying to save?
Yeah.
The very first instance is we need to be building and creating much less.
Yeah.
We would hope that 90% of the buildings that we will have in 50 years are the buildings that we already have. Yeah. But I think that does segue onto a point around, you talk about house building. Yeah. And, often I'm asked this question, and in the past, we've delivered, novel volumetric house building systems, and those are very good and useful in lots of ways. But I think in our business, we've always thought of it as a means to an end. It surprises people sometimes when I talk about our business and say that we aren't really particularly timber people. Yeah. We're sustainability people. Yeah. And actually, we're embodied carbon people. Yeah. Now, if you take house building as an example, there is a great opportunity for delivering mid-rise housing across the country at scale, solving lots of the problems that we have in terms of labor supply, the traditional
off-site manufacturing, if you like.
All of those sorts of things. Yeah. But the flip side is a large proportion of how we solve our housing crisis will be in those two-story, run-of-the-mill, slightly sprawling, hopefully slightly less sprawling estates that we build. And, I would say mass timber is not the solution for that. Yeah. Ultimately, just because wood is a sustainable material and there is value in storing carbon, using our cities as urban carbon sinks, by the same token, putting more material into a building than we need and bringing it over from Austria or whatever it is that we need to do to deliver that's not the right solution. So for us, it is always the right material in the right place.
But I think that's a very interesting point, because you see a lot of it on social media that we should be all building in timber, but obviously the global supply wouldn't be able to facilitate us to build everything in timber anyway. So it needs to be multifaceted. All materials we're using today will probably continue to keep using. Like, we're still going to use concrete, we're still going to use steel, we might use less block work because we might have more efficient solutions than brick and block, but nevertheless we're still going to continue using these materials. I would guess. Is that your opinion?
No, I think that's absolutely true. We don't put wood in the ground. Wood and the wet don't mix too well. So there's always space for a concrete ground floor. But what is important is that we don't stop thinking about sustainability when we use those other materials. Yeah. So for example, one of the key things to an efficient and cost-effective timber building, particularly in open plan buildings like offices, is to set the structural grid correctly. Yeah. So we will often start with a narrower structural grid than our clients are used to. Yeah. But the interesting thing is, an asymmetric grid that is shallower in one axis than the other is a more sustainable grid in concrete too. Yeah. If you ask that slab to span 9 meters in each axis, and you don't need to. Yeah. And so I think that the attitude we've always had, we talk about the idea of an architecture of sufficiency. Yeah. So the analogy I would use is, in the past, we saw that sustainability had to shout sustainability. It had to have a whirligig on the roof and mice running in and out of the hay bales. These are all good things. But what we wanted to do was say, your architecture can be excellent, but you should do enough and no more. Yeah. You shouldn't have 30 sweaters that you've bought from a budget offshore delivery company, but you should have, and you shouldn't also walk around with big holes in your jumpers to prove you're sustainable. Just buy a good jumper, right? And so for us, it's about the right materials in the right places. But this idea that we can just throw another log on the fire, I'll just have that transfer structure because I want to have a 3-bed penthouse on the top and it doesn't line up. Yeah. Well, look, maybe we don't need that. And, I think that's what we see sometimes in the way, come back to that word, why is timber in vogue? I presented one of our most important buildings, the black and white building, at an awards jury last year. And the question I got was, I've seen loads of these timber buildings. They're all over Dezeen. They're in wallpaper. What's special about what you've done here? And so I took a photo of the floor under construction. Yeah. And I said, carry this photo in your mind when you next go on to Dezeen. Think about just how little building there is in this building. Yeah. Right? There is the absolute minimum to create just enough. That's a really good quality building, but no more. Yeah. And go back to Dezeen and see the soaring 2-meter high double glue lambs that go across a column. Yeah. Now, look, I'm not here to be a fun sponge, right? We save our carbon so that we can use it if you want that football stadium, if you want that art gallery, spend it.
Yeah.
But what we are doing that I think is unique and exciting is this idea of this sufficiency.
Yeah.
What is enough for a durable, long-lasting, beautiful, and sustainable building?
It's an interesting concept coming from an architect of sufficiency and efficiency, albeit no disrespect or anything. It's usually the quantity sphere coming in saying, oh, well, hang on a second, we need to value engineer or reduce your structure, reduce your facade solution in order to keep it on cost. But coming from a sustainability perspective, use just enough, just what you need to use and no more is a very nice concept.
And it can be enough to make something brilliant and exciting.
Yeah, of course.
But what is enough? And I think there's a good point you raised there. And, I know speaking to you about the work that you do, about the way that we use the tools we have available to us to talk about all of these things in a kind of 3 or 4 dimensional way to be constantly appraising these. But I think, the challenge we set down to our peers is, when was the last time you started a planning application knowing what it would be made of?
Yeah.
Or did you have an assumption that one of that team of bright and talented people that you might see at Reba Stage 3 would solve the challenges? And I think that's not critique. I grew up in that world. We were all educated at different times. But I think now our challenge is to say, well, let's bring materials and the fundament of how we make our buildings back into the very core of what we do when we design, rather than making that something we ask somebody else to solve, where we hand those problems to other people. And I think you're right to observe that as something that has fallen out of the lexicon of the average architect.
And the questions are being asked earlier because the decisions need to be taken earlier, because those early decisions have a fundamental impact on the project, both, I'm always saying commercial, but it is from a cost carbon perspective now. That's the language we're now speaking when we speak from a QS perspective. But when you were talking about timber there and those 2.5 meter deep beams, what is the challenges in building in timber, and how are they mitigated? Challenges you've come across over your career, and how did you guys mitigate those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, you spoke earlier about the idea that it's a very historic material, but that it suddenly feels like this new scary technology that people have to learn. I think the first challenge is hearts and minds and wallets. They're quite closely connected for some people, the heart, the mind, and the wallet. But, it really was that first thing of trying to work out how to speak the language of the people procuring. Because of those super deep beams, lots of our clients have had this experience of saying, I want to investigate working in timber. I've got maybe a planning consent or whatever. I'll pass it to my QS and say, can I afford it? And of course, if you take the cross section of a concrete building and you color it in yellow, it is not a timber building. No. It's a concrete building made of timber. And you end up with those components. You end up with cost, challenges, not necessarily the sustainability you hope and want for. So some projects, like one that we did very early in our sort of research career, because that is a really fundamental part of our business now. We were commissioned by the American and Canadian Binational Softwood Lumber Board to provide study so that they could look at their building codes and see how they could support modern mass timber. And they wanted data from around 100 UK mass timber buildings. So, the first thing we did, I think it's about acquiring competency. And before competency comes knowledge and going and learning, what are those stories? How much quicker is it? What does it cost? And then, of course, it's just moving through those work stages and addressing the challenges that come. But again, I think perhaps 10 years ago, people might have said, oh, don't worry too much. You take the concrete out, you put the timber in. But I think we're really clear now that it's a word that's got renewed kind of resonance in the wake of the Building Safety Act here in the UK and new controls. The word competence, really, really important one. And I think we're clear that, a mass timber building in the UK is not a traditional construction. It works in different ways.